Okay, so we're going to continue our discussion today of redistribution and fairness. Remember, we talked about how most of this class was just about efficiency, and we had that simple measure of welfare, which is adding consumer and producer surplus. We talked last time about why that might not be the right measure, and how we can actually do interpersonal comparisons in economics, how we can move beyond the simple addition of consumer and producer surplus to richer interpersonal comparisons using a social welfare function. And then we talked about the inherent equity efficiency trade-off. We went through a model that illustrated the inefficiencies that come from the leaky bucket. And we started, and you finished in section, an example how you can put that all together. How you can take the concept of leaky bucket together with the concept of social welfare and use it to decide if a given redistribution raises social welfare or lowers it. In other words, is the benefit of redistributing the pie worth shrinking the pie? That's what it comes down to. Okay, we know how to maximize the size of the pie. We learned that, we're done with that, we're done with perfect competition. We know how to maximize the size of the pie. The question is it worth shrinking the pie to redistribute the resources? Now, what I want to talk about today is how we do it in practice. What do we do in practice to actually redistribute money in the US? And like I said, we have two forms, two potential leaks in the bucket, two steps to redistributing money. One is to tax the people who have the resources, and the other is to transfer money to those who don't. So I want to talk today about both sides of that equation. Once again, doing what I do in about 12 lectures in 1441 in one lecture here, at a very broad level to understand how taxation and transfers work in our country and how in practice we implement the idea of redistributing social wealth. Let's start with figure 23.1. The figures today will all be from my textbook. Figure 23.1 shows how we raise money in America. This is a simple pie chart. So about 37% of the money we raise in America is from individual income taxes. That's the taxes you file every April 15th. You probably haven't much yet, but you will when you're grown-ups. The next biggest is Social Security contributions. These are what we call payroll taxes. These differ from income taxes in that you don't pay it on your income at the end of the year. You pay it on your earnings as the year goes on. If you've ever earned money, you'll see there's a line on your stub called FICA, or another one called Medicare. These are our federal payroll contributions, and that is the second biggest source of revenue. The third biggest source of revenue is consumption taxes, mostly state sales taxes, but also excise taxes on things like alcohol and cigarettes. That's specific taxes on alcohol, cigarettes, and gas. The fourth biggest is the property tax, which is basically the tax you pay on the value of your house. And the fifth biggest, besides the other, actually the sixth biggest after other, is the corporate income tax. We only raise $1 in every $20 in America from taxing corporations. Think about that. Look at this graph. We raise 37% for income taxes, 25% for Social Security contributions, 17% for consumption taxes, all taxes that fall on the average Joe, and 5% from the tax we raise on corporations. How should we feel about that? Should that make us irate that we're favoring corporations or not? It turns out the answer is not obvious. Because to understand the answer, we need to, when we talk about taxation, we need to think about the fairness of the whole tax system, or what we call in economics, the incidence of taxes. Who actually bears the tax? And it turns out this chart is very misleading. Because it turns out the party that sends the money to the government is not necessarily the party that actually bears the burden of the tax, which is sort of weird, right? You say, well, how can that be? They're sending the money to the government. And the answer is it ignores the fact that the market reacts to taxation. And that incidence is about who ultimately bears the burden after the market has responded. So we're going to define economic incidence of a tax as the difference in the individual's resources before and after a tax is imposed. The economic incidence is not the amount they send to the government. It's the difference in their resources from before to after the tax is imposed. And we'll see that can end up being very different, the amount, than the check they actually write. To understand why, let's look at figure 23.2. Figure 23.2 is an example of a market, the market for gas. Gas is a market, we have a specific excise tax on gas, a certain amount per gallon. There's a federal excise tax, and states layer excise tax on top of that. So let's start by thinking about the market for gas. Standard supply and demand model. You've got the quantity of gas on the x-axis, the price of gas on the y-axis. And in this highly out-of-date graph that clearly needs to be updated, I've got us selling 100 billion gallons of gas at $1.50 a gallon. My fantasies of past life. Okay? So imagine we're initially in that equilibrium. And remember, that is the equilibrium. Remember the definition of equilibrium. That makes both producers and consumers happy. Producers are willing to sell 100 billion gallons at $1.50 a gallon. Consumers are willing to buy 100 billion gallons at $1.50 a gallon. The market's in equilibrium. Now, imagine that we levy a tax of 50 cents per gallon. Let's say we levy it on the producers of gas. Let's say we go to the gas companies and say, look, for every, you rich gas companies, gas oil companies are making record profits. So we go to them and say, you know what, you rich oil and gas companies, for every gallon of gas you sell, we're going to make you send a check for 50 cents to the government because you're making too much money and we want to, tax you, but not consumers. We want to tax the greedy corporations. So we say 50 cents per gallon. You have to write a check 50 cents per gallon you sell. What does that do to our graph? Well, think of it from the producer's perspective. What you've done is simply raise their marginal cost. Whatever their marginal cost was before, it's now 50 cents per gallon higher. Because for every gallon they produce, they have to spend 50 cents more paying the government. So that acts as a shift inward in their supply curve. In other words, the point is, before they were happy to provide 100 billion gallons at $1.50. But now if you want to supply 100 billion gallons, you're going to pay them $2. Why? Well, because in this perfectly competitive market, they were zero profit before at $1.50. If they're sending 50 cents a gallon to the government, they have to make $2 to be zero profit now. So that's what they'd have to get. So we get a shift in supply, and therefore, through the adjustment equilibrium, we get a new outcome, which is we get a new equilibrium at point D, which is since supply is shifted inward, we get a new equilibrium with only 90 billion gallons of gas being sold at a price of $1.80. Why do we get there? Well, it's a standard market adjustment we've been through already. Okay? And it could be $1.80, it could be $1, I'm not saying this is the definite answer, but it's just an example of how a market would adjust. Okay? Questions about that? Just an example of how a market would adjust. Now, let's ask, what is the burden on producers? What is the producer burden from this tax? Well, let's just do some simple math. The producer used to get $1.50. Okay? So they used to get $1.50. Now they have to send 50 cents to the government, but they now get $1.80 per gallon. So on net, their burden is 20 cents. That is, they are bearing a burden of 20 cents. And you can see that if you look at the graph. The producer used to get $1.50. Now they get $1.80. So they get 30 cents more a gallon, but they have to send 50 cents to the government. So on net, they're out 20. On net, they're out 20 cents. What's the consumer burden? Well, the consumer used to pay, now pays $1.80. Consumer used to pay $1.50, so their burden is 30 cents. You can see that once again in the graph. Consumers used to pay $1.50, now they pay $1.80. They're not paying 30 cents more. So look at what happened. Who lost more from this tax? Consumers or producers? Consumers. We were trying to tax the greedy oil companies, but what did we end up doing? we ended up making consumers 30 cents worse per gallon and producers only 20 cents worse per gallon. That is, the incidence was not the same as the amount of the check sent in. Even though the producers sent in a check for 50 cents a gallon, that was offset by the fact they're getting 30 cents more a gallon. So in net, they only were out 20 cents a gallon. Even though consumers weren't touched, in theory, the government said, I'm not hurting you consumers. In practice, consumers were hurt because consumers had to pay 30 cents more a gallon. And this is why a graph like figure 23.1 can be misleading. Because think about corporations. When you tax corporations, some of what's going to happen is the rich corporation owners will take it, but some of it is they'll pass it on to higher prices to consumers. So it's not like taxing corporations is purely getting at the rich guys. It's also getting consumers. It's not as easy as that graph makes it look. Okay? Now, here's something to note. Let's note the following interesting phenomenon. Look at figure 23.3. Imagine that we had, instead of taxing producers, we tax consumers. The way the gas tax usually works, right? Let's say the way the gas tax worked is literally, it's sort of weird, but the government said to you, for every gallon you buy, I'm going to make you send me 50 cents. It'd be a weird tax to think about. Let's imagine the way the tax worked, okay? Is the government said, I'm going to track your gas purchases, and for every gallon you buy, I'm going to make you send me 50 cents. Well, now the supply curve doesn't change, marginal cost doesn't change, but demand changes. Consumers used to be willing to buy 100 billion gallons at $1.50, but now their marginal willingness to pay falls. If they were indifferent between paying $1.50 for the 100 billionth gallon, now they have to send 50 cents to the government, they're going to be paying $1 for the 100 billionth gallon. They're not willing to pay $1.50 anymore. They're only willing to pay $1. Why? Because that last marginal consumer was indifferent. His marginal willingness to pay for the 100 billionth gallon was $1.50. That's his total willingness to pay. If he has to send 50 cents to the government, he's only willing to pay $1 to the gas company to get that gallon. So that's a shift downward in the demand curve. The demand curve shifts down, we get to new equilibrium with a price of $1.30. By the way, this shift, this is natural. This is because the curves are the same. What is the new producer burden? Did someone tell me? What's the new producer burden? What's the incidence of this? Even though producers aren't sending a check to the government, what is the incidence of this tax on producers in this case? How much worse off are producers? Yeah. 20 cents. Why? Exactly. And same person, what about consumers? How much worse off are they? Because? They save 20 cents a gallon, but they send a 50-cent check to the government, right? Consumers get a lower price, but then they have to send that check to the government. So they're worse off 30 cents. Producers who weren't involved in this, it was just a tax on those greedy consumers, they're getting 20 cents less a gallon too. Economic incidence is not, so 2 points here. First, it hammers home the point that economic difference is different than who sends the check. But second of all, it hammers home the point that for a given tax in a given market, it does not matter who pays the tax. This is a profound insight. For a given supply and demand curve and a given total tax, it doesn't matter who sends the check in. The incidence is the same. That's very profound. That says it is totally irrelevant. That says politicians are free to label a tax any way they want. But for a given market and a given size tax, consumers and producers end up in the same position. Or what we say in public finance is the side of the market's irrelevant. It doesn't matter who actually sends the check to the government. Okay? What matters is how big the tax is and what elasticities are of supply and demand. That's incredibly powerful. Okay? My guess is most of you, without spending a long time pondering it, if I'd said walking this class doesn't matter if consumers pay the gas tax or oil companies pay the gas tax, you would have said it does matter. But it doesn't. It doesn't matter as long as the tax is the same and the market's the same. Questions about that? And I've just blown your mind. Yeah?
So does that mean that depending on how the market is set up and also how elastic it is?
You're getting ahead of me. Hold on. Other questions about this? Yeah?
Is there like a certain value or like at what point is it that the consumer doesn't bear higher burden
Excellent, excellent question. Both great questions that lead to the next point. The next point is, who bears the taxes? Who actually bears them? Well, that, it turns out, is going to be determined by the elasticities of these curves. Let's look at figure 23.4. In the first case, we have a case of inelastic demand for gas. This is probably right in the very, very short run. Probably day to day, if the price of gas goes up a lot, people don't adjust their consumption the next day. Okay, so gas is probably pretty inelastically demanded in the short run. Well, in that case, what happens? Let's say we tax producers, the first example. The supply curve shifts up. But what happens to price? It goes up by the amount of the tax. Why? Because consumers are going to buy the same amount of gas no matter what. So you can just charge them whatever the hell you want. So who bears the burden of this tax? How much is on producers and how much is on consumers when demand is inelastic? Yeah. Exactly. It's all on consumers. Flip that around. Yeah, that's good. Good answer. Flip that around. Okay? Now imagine we're in the very long run where people can, shift to bicycles and walk and demand for gas is super elastic. In fact, let's imagine it's perfectly elastic. Not true, but let's imagine it. Now what happens? Well, we tax the producers, but they can't raise the price because demand's perfectly elastic. So now, who bears the burden of the taxes? The producer. The consumer doesn't bear it because if the producer tries to pass 1 cent on it, then they'll just stop buying gas. So the producer has to bear it all. So what determines who bears the taxes is elasticities. And basically, the bottom line is those who are the most elastic will be the best at avoiding taxes. This is not the right intuition, but here's how I think about it. I think of it like negotiating power. Think about there's this tax, and consumers and producers are negotiating who's going to bear it. Well, if consumers are perfectly elastic, they're like, fuck you, I'm not going to bear it. You try to give me any of it, I'm gone. But if they're really inelastic, producers are like, I'm sticking you with it, and I know you're going to take it because you have no choice. Your demand's perfectly inelastic. Yeah?
Why are you measuring growth by changing price, not changing price?
Excellent question. We're going to come back to that. The way we think of incidence is the reason we think about it is the change in price. The reason we use price and we don't pay attention to the x-axis at all, is another way to ask your question, is we're thinking about an incremental, infinitesimally small change. So x wouldn't change. Okay, x would change. Basically, x does change. Let me go back. Let me say this differently. We're focusing on incidence because basically the fairness aspect, scratch my first answer. Here's a better answer. In both equilibriums, before and after the tax, everyone is perfectly happy with where they are. So it's not about efficiency. You're an efficient outcome before and after. Okay? It's about fairness. And fairness about who's paying more before or after. So not a great answer, but that's the way to think about it. Okay, but it leads to the next section I'm going to teach. Okay, other questions about that? Okay, so elasticity determines who bears the burden. Okay? So here's a great example of that. Let me ask a hard question, see if you guys get this. Cities levy taxes on hotels, on hotel rooms. When you go to a hotel room in a big city, there's a city tax on that hotel room. That tax on hotels rooms is borne, as you could now know, partially by the hotels and partially by the consumers of hotel rooms. After Airbnb came along, how did that shift the burden of that tax? So there's taxes on hotels. Whoa, okay. How did it shift the burden of the tax? Because, exactly. What Airbnb did was make consumer demand for hotels more elastic. When consumer demands for hotels more elastic, producers couldn't pass the tax onto them as much. So producers had to bear more of it. That's an example of how this matters in the real world, and there's evidence of that. Okay? So this isn't just saying, a different question I could ask is, well, what happens when Airbnb comes in? Hotel prices will have to fall. That's a different question. Okay? This question is, what happens to the effect of a tax on hotels? And the answer is it's borne more by hotels and less by consumers, because consumers look more like the second panel of figure 23.4 and less like the first panel. So basically, the more elastic consumers become, the more they can avoid taxes. The less elastic, the more they'll be stuck with them. Okay? Now, that's fairness. But let me come to this great question over here, which is, okay, that's just about prices. What about profits? What about quantities? Well, that comes to the second, back to our original concept, which is efficiency. Which is, now let's talk about the efficient aspect of taxes. I misspoke when I said it wasn't that they're efficient in both outcomes, they're in equilibrium in both outcomes. Let's come to the efficiency of taxation. Now, let's look at a tax. Now let's go back to our original tax. Figure 23.5 goes back to our original tax on producers of 50 cents a gallon. Same thing, initially in equilibrium at P1, Q1. Now you get new equilibrium at P1, at P2, Q2. $1.80, 90 billion gallons. What about efficiency? Well, efficiency is what has happened to the social surplus. Fairness is about division of social surplus, and that's why I just focused on prices. Efficiency is about the size of the social surplus, and now we focus on quantities. Well, what's happened to the size of the social surplus? Well, it used to be, if you look at it, consumers used to have the consumer surplus of the area above the $1.50 price line and below the blue demand line. Producers used to have producer surplus of the area below the $1.50 price line and above the blue supply line. Now the quantity has shrunk. We've reduced consumer surplus. And as a result, we've reduced consumer surplus and producer surplus. Now, consumer surplus is just the amount above the $1.80 line and below the demand curve. Producer surplus is just the amount below the $1.80 line and above the red supply curve. Both consumer and producer surplus have shrunk, and we've created a deadweight loss. So there's an efficiency cost to taxation. This is the source of the leak in the bucket. I talked about it last time more casually. I talked a couple lectures about why we care about moral hazard, why we care that there's people are, for example, not working, or here it's why do we care about the lost gallons of gas? We care about lost gallons of gas because that's a cost to society. There are 10 billion gallons of gas that were being sold before in trades that make both parties happen. Those trades have disappeared. We have created an inefficiency by taxing the gas market. That is the deadweight loss of taxation, and that's the leak in the bucket. The leak in the bucket from taxing things is equal to the deadweight loss of taxation. That's the first leak. That's the tax leak. The tax leak is the deadweight loss of taxation, the inefficiency we've created by taxing goods. Now, here's the mind-blowing part. Look at figure 23.6. Now I take a gas market with more and less. I don't do imperfectly elastic and elastic here. I do sort of more realistically, more or less elastic. Look what happens to the deadweight loss. When demand for gas is very inelastic, the deadweight loss is much smaller than when the demand for gas is very elastic. Indeed, if the demand for gas were perfectly inelastic, there'd be zero inefficiency from tax. Why? Why would taxes not be inefficient at all if demand was inelastic? Yeah. Because there's no change in consumers are going to buy. There's no trades that aren't being made. You're screwing consumers. That's the fairness part. But there's no efficiency loss. There's no trade that's not being made. As a result, the more elastic demand gets, the bigger the efficiency cost gets, because more and more trades are being blocked from happening. Okay? So basically, we get this interesting contrast, which is that as elasticities go up, as elasticities of demand go up, on the one hand, consumers escape taxation, right? On the other hand, their escape in the taxation is what creates inefficiency and deadweight loss. Once again, sort of an equity efficiency trade-off, right? The fairest taxes, the taxes which, if we consider ourselves as consumers, we care about ourselves as consumers, the fairest taxes are the taxes on goods which are most elastically demanded because we don't have to bear them. But they're also the most distortionary taxes, the taxes that create the biggest leak in the bucket. Another way of thinking about this equity efficiency trade-off. The more elastic is demand, the more consumers avoid taxes, but the more inefficiencies you'll cause. Okay? Questions about that? Yeah? Well, let me ask the question differently. Look at figure 23, 4. A, first panel. Here's another way to ask your question. Why aren't they charging infinity? It's inelastic demand. Why aren't they charging infinity? It's another version of your question. The answer is that there's always external pressure on producers. Why don't monopolists charge infinity? Because ultimately there's external pressure. Now in this case, the reason they're not charging infinity is because at some point, people will start to drop out. Okay? So your answer is, why don't they just shift it more? Well, sure, but then why aren't they charging more today? They could always charge. The answer is, there's other market forces constraining them. Why isn't Apple charging us more for the iPhone? Well, because the Android exists. People prefer the iPhone, but Apple's clearly decided that if it was $2,000 an iPhone, people would just switch too much to Androids. They're already making a good ungodly profit. Why not more? Because they've reached some point where they've decided it's the optimal point. Okay? So basically, the key point is market power doesn't necessarily mean you could do what you want. But this does raise the interesting issue, which is beyond this class, but if you just take 1420, industrial organization, which is a lot of people claim that during this inflationary period, part of what has driven inflation is firms increasing their profit margins. Now you might say, well, look, why would firms, if firms could have increased their profit margins before, they would have. Why are they doing it now? And the answer is sort of in this question, which is a little bit hidden now. Prices are going up anyway. So they can blame the war or the president, whoever they want to blame. Okay? So it's a good time to raise their profit margins because prices are going up. If 5 years ago, when inflation was 0, if they raise their profit margin, everyone notices, hey, why is Coke more expensive? But now Coke's getting way more expensive. If you make it even $1 more expensive, people think, well, that's just inflation. So actually it becomes, it's sort of an answer to your question in the real world, opportunities like taxation or inflation are often opportunities companies use to sort of raise their profit margins, but not in our more simple models. Okay? Other questions? Okay. That's the tax side of it. Now let's talk about the transfer side of it. So that's the first leak. The first leak is the deadweight loss caused by taxation. The second leak in the bucket is the inefficiencies, the deadweight loss caused by transfers. Okay? So now let's go to figure 23.7. 23.7 is the figure we had last time that showed the leaks in the bucket. The TARP part of the top, remember the black line is your old budget constraint before the government came in. Remember the program, we're transferring money to people who were poor, paid for by a tax on those who were richer. The tax led to the inward shifted red budget line to the left of the diagram. And we now understand why that caused inefficiency. People work less is produced in society, that's a deadweight loss. What about the part if we transfer? Well, here we see the inefficiency right away, which is all those people who at least were working some now don't work at all. Basically, if we set up a welfare program like this, if you are anyone who wanted to work less than 250 hours, then literally there's a 100% tax rate on your work. Why work? You're going to get the same amount of money whether you work or not. Because every dollar you earn, they're just going to take $1 away. Remember, the transfer formula was the transfer we gave you was the max of 0 or your income minus 5,000. What that means, every dollar of income you earn, we take $1 away of the transfer. No, I'm sorry, 5,000 minus your income. I did that backwards. 5,000 minus your income. Right. So it's like 100% tax on income. Every dollar you earn, we take $1 away. So why work? That is the transfer side of the leaky bucket, that people quit working. So now the question is, what can we do about it? And governments recognize this problem. So here you're a government, and you want to redistribute from the rich to the poor. And let's even solve the tax problem by finding inelastic sources of inelastic markets to tax. So you've reduced, so for example, a very inelastic market to tax is property. People's houses are there. So let's say you're taxing property. That's pretty inelastic. You don't create a deadweight loss tax side. But now you want to say, I'm creating all this deadweight loss on the transfer side because I'm causing all these low-income people just quit work. Because why work? How can I deal with that? Well, there's two ways governments deal with that problem in reality. The first way they deal with it is through what we call categorical welfare. Categorical welfare. We give cash not to everyone, but to people who meet certain criteria. So for example, we have in the US the TANF program, Temporary Aid to Needy Families. That is money for poor single moms. So it's not just being poor, but you have to also be a single mom. We have our biggest cash transfer program to the US, to the poor people, it's called SSI, Supplemental Security Income. That's for poor disabled people. You have to be poor and disabled. Why do we do categoric transfers? Because we're trying to take advantage of targeting. We're trying to take advantage of targeting. Obviously, we want to give money to low-income people, those people who need it. We talked about how any sensible social welfare function would deliver redistribution to low-income people. The problem is in giving to them, we make this huge leak in the bucket. What if, however, we could give it to them without creating a leak in the bucket? Think about a simple example. Imagine that there's two reasons people are low income. They're unskilled and they're lazy. Okay? Now, we would like to protect the unskilled. From behind the veil of ignorance, behind you're born, you don't know if you can be skilled or unskilled. So we'd like to all have a system that protects the unskilled. We're not sure we want to protect the lazy. They should probably work. Okay? Let's say we're all born with an irremovable tattoo on our head, irremovable and inaddable, you can't add it, that says unskilled or skilled. Well, then we'd simply say, I'm going to look at your tattoo. If your tattoo says unskilled, I'm going to give you money. If your tattoo says skilled, I'm not going to. I don't care what your income is, because I know you can make a good living. If you're not doing so, it just means you're lazy. Then we'd have no deadweight loss. Because why? Because you couldn't change. Deadweight loss is created by what? People changing their behavior to avoid taxation. Well, if it's based on a tattoo that's on your head when you're born, you can't change your behavior. Unless parents can do in vitro tattooing or something. Okay? You can't change your behavior. So there's no deadweight loss. It's inelastic. The supply of unskilled tattoos is inelastic. There's no deadweight loss. So if we could simply know who was truly in need and who wasn't really in need, they were just quitting their job, we could redistribute without deadweight loss. Problem is we don't. Probably a good thing that we don't. Okay? We don't have to get into the debate between my daughter and myself on tattoos. That's for another day. Okay? But what we do know is things which are correlated with your underlying skill, regardless of your work effort. Okay? So let's take something like blindness. Especially, genetic blindness. You're born blind. Well, that's pretty much like being born with unskilled stamped on your head. Now, to be fair, many blind people succeed enormously. Blind students at MIT who go on to incredibly fruitful careers. But it's true that if you're blind, you're most likely very needy of help. Then we'd say we give to blind people. By making it categorical, we're able to try to target the benefits without creating deadweight loss. Okay? That's why I have disability. Single moms, well, basically, as long as single moms didn't sort of choose to be single moms, they just got stuck with a kid because their partner left them or something like that, then it's going to be really hard to work. We know they're needy. Someone's got to keep an eye on the kid. They can't work without childcare. So that's another indicator of needing help. Now that one is, but that's a little tricky. Because is it something people can change with their behavior? Well, of course. People can choose to become single moms. So it's not like genetic blindness, which isn't changed by your behavior. Single motherhood is potentially changed by your behavior. So now we start to get in a murky realm of, is it a good idea to target benefits to single moms? Or in fact, as many conservatives claimed back in the 1980s when this sort of became a major topic of discussion, are we actually making society worse by creating single moms? Are we actually making things worse by targeting benefits to single moms, by actually creating single motherhood in America? Okay? And indeed, there was a very famous book that was written in 1984, okay, that looked at a simple graph of the generosity of welfare and single motherhood. So this is time, and this is like 1960, and this is like 1980, which is when their data ended. And if this was the generosity of welfare benefits, welfare was getting more generous, and this is single motherhood. Single motherhood was going up. So it was like, look, by making welfare generous, we're encouraging single mothers. We're not rewarding those who need it. We're encouraging them. The problem is, this is what's happened since. Okay? It turns out, through decades of careful study, single motherhood has almost nothing to do with welfare benefits. Basically, people don't decide to become single mothers based on cash concerns. It's based on other concerns in their life. So it turns out the inefficiency of targeting money to single moms is low. Because what drives that inefficiency? What drives it is the elasticity of single motherhood with respect to welfare. That's the key parameter. That's the key elasticity that drives the dead weight loss. The more elastic single motherhood is with respect to welfare, the more inefficiency we get by targeting single motherhood. But it turns out this is approximately 0. So it turns out this is a pretty good way to target people. Here's what's ironic. You might say, well, look, it's uncontroversial. Single moms is controversial. Targeting the disabled is uncontroversial. Turns out you'd have that backwards. Turns out the elasticity of claiming SSI with respect to welfare benefits is greater than 0. Because, as I mentioned on workers' comp, it is hard to monitor whether people are truly disabled. And it turns out the more generous you make disability benefits, the more people claim SSI. The more people claim that they're disabled. So now, here's the way to think about it. Let's go back to our equity efficiency trade-off. With single mothers, there's no equity efficiency trade-off. They are a poor group, and by giving them money, you don't create dead weight loss. With disabled people, there is an equity efficiency trade-off, which is they are poor people, but you create dead weight loss by giving them money. So for this one, you don't even need a social welfare function. You're done. For this one, you need a social welfare function to decide if it's worth it, to decide if the dead weight loss you're creating, how it compares to the benefits you're getting for giving money to poor, needy people. Okay? Questions about that? So that's one way we deal with this inefficiency, this dead weight loss. The other way is by changing the way we pay benefits and making them in kind. Okay? The problem with cash transfer systems is everyone likes cash. So it creates a maximum incentive to distort your behavior to qualify. Well, what if instead of cash, I gave you a shitty public apartment with leaking roof and it's just sort of in a bad neighborhood and stuff like that? Well, then maybe people who didn't really need it wouldn't change their behavior to get it. Maybe the only people who would take that are the people who really need it. So maybe we don't need to have you tattooed on your forehead. Maybe we can get you to reveal whether you truly need help or not by giving you something that's not so great. It's sort of a perverse logic. But the logic is the way we get people to reveal whether they're truly needy is by giving them something only truly needy people would want, which is a crappy apartment. Okay? And this is a major reason why we deliver most of the benefits to the poor on an in-kind basis. There's about a 10-to-1 ratio in the US of the benefits we give to the poor through things like medical care and housing and food to what we give them in cash. About a 10-to-1 ratio. Okay? We give much more in goods. Now, part of the reason is the theory I just gave you. Part of the reason is because we're paternalistic as a society. You remember way back in like the third lecture, I talked about food stamps and how it'd be more efficient to give people cash, but we don't because we think they'll spend it on cocaine. Okay? That's the main reason we do in-kind benefits realistically, is because we don't trust people to spend their money. But there's an economic logic for it, which is that it's a way to get people to reveal their types when you can't really know who should be targeted and who shouldn't. Okay? Once again, the trade-off. We'd love to give everyone nice apartments, but in doing so, we create a huge deadweight loss of people quitting their jobs to get the nice apartments. So it's a trade-off. Now, once again, this is the dismal science. And all I do is talk about trade-offs all day. So let me actually end the lecture on a positive note, which is there's actually one program that's not a trade-off. There's actually one program we've discovered which actually redistributes money and increases efficiency. And that's what we call conditional cash transfers, which is money we give to people conditional on them doing efficient activities. The classic example in the US is called the Earned Income Tax Credit. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a wage subsidy program. It's a wage subsidy. What does that mean? It's the opposite of a tax. The Earned Income Tax Credit is such that whenever you earn money, the government said, taking some away, we'll match it, as long as you're poor. So if we look at figure 23.8, this shows how the Earned Income Tax Credit works. On the x-axis is earned income. On the y-axis is the amount of the EITC you get. What you see is if you earn no money, you get nothing from the government of this program. But as you earn money, until you make $14,800, for every dollar you earn, the government gives you another 40 cents. So the first $15,000 you earn, you get another 40 cents from the government. It's a negative tax. At that point, it caps out. The biggest check you get is $59.20, and then they start to take it away. Why? Because they don't want this money to go to everyone. They don't want it to go to low income. So by the time your income's $47,000, you're done. So the idea is targeted to low-income groups. So you give these low-income people money, but then as their income goes up, you take it back away. Now, the important point to know about this program is it's not all obvious what this program will do. Okay? Think about someone who, if you think about someone who's below $14,800, the effect of the program is obvious. Take someone who's earning zero. What is the income effect on them of this program? Well, it's zero. They were earning zero. What's the substitution effect? It's massively positive. Their wage has gone from X to X times 1.4. So for someone earning zero, the effect is unambiguously positive. Okay? But now, let's imagine someone earning $19,350. And they're thinking about, should I earn $100 more? So they're at $19,350. They're getting their check from the government of $59.20. And now they're saying, should I earn $100 more? What happens if they earn $100 more? Well, they get the $100 check, but they lose $21 of their $59.20. Their $59.20 goes down by $21. So they end up only at $58.99. Why? Because we're taking it back away as they earn money. So effectively, we are taxing them. So now, we've created a new tax. We're trying to help poor people, but in doing so, we've created a new tax. Why? Because we want to keep it to poor people. And when we do that, take it away as people's income goes up. So the effect of this program is ambiguous. On the one hand, you take the guys who weren't working at all and give them big money to go to work. But in order to phase that out, you tax the people already working and make them less likely to work. It's assuming substitution effects dominate income effects. Okay? People understand that? Questions about that? Yeah?
Why do they only tax people who are earning less than $47,000?
Oh, well, we have separate taxes for the richer people. This is just don't think of this as a tax, think of it as a targeting mechanism. We're trying to target to low-income people. The way we target low-income people is by taking away as their income goes up. We don't think anyone over 47,440 deserves this low-income transfer. So we're taking away, by the time you get there, you don't get any more. We have separate tax on rich guys. This is just this program per se. Good question. Other questions? Yeah. What's that? Oh, because for every $100 you earn, you lose 21 cents. You lose 21 cents per dollar on that slope. Okay? Other questions? Yeah. You could flatten it. Okay, what would happen then? Well, one good thing and one bad thing. The good thing is there'd be a lower tax rate. The bad thing is if we don't think people above 47,440 need this money, we're giving money away to people who don't need it because it'd go out to like 60,000 now. So the trade-off is you could also get rid of the slope. You could keep it there. But then Bill Gates gets to check 5920. Okay? The point is if you want this to low-income people, you have to phase it out. Now, we can argue what the right phase-out is. You can always argue about these numbers. And one awesome thing about working in government is literally people in government get to just come up with these numbers. I mean, how cool is that? You get to come up with how much money people are going to get in their lives. Okay, so there's lots of fights on what these numbers should be. But the bottom line is this structure you need if you want a program that's targeted. You need this structure. So here's the trade-off. We encourage people at the bottom of the income distribution to go to work, but we discourage people in that middle part of the income distribution from working. Well, guess what? We can go to the evidence and evaluate that. And guess what we learn? The first thing we learn is the first effect is huge. The earned income tax credit has a huge effect in encouraging people to work. Okay? Best estimates are that basically if you take especially single moms, there's something like a 15% increase in the odds they work. I mean, huge, in the odds that they work. And there is no evidence that it causes people on that other part to work less. So there's good evidence it takes the 0 people and brings them in the labor market. There's no evidence it takes the 19,000 people and causes them to work less. Why is that? Well, there's two possible reasons. One is, remember, for the 0 people, the effect is unambiguous. 0 income effect, positive substitution effect. For these people, the effect is ambiguous. We talked about that with labor supply. Income substitution effects, here you have a substitution effect saying to work less, okay? But the income effect might go the other way. Actually, no, let me go back. That's wrong. Because remember, they do have more income. They do have more income. So the income saying work less, substitution effect's working less. So that can't explain it. They're richer. No, I had it right. Let me go back. I had it right. On the margin for that next $100, there's going to be a substitution effect. They're getting $21 poorer, which should make them take less leisure and work more, but they're only taking home 79 cents on the dollar, which has substitution effect and makes them work less. So it's ambiguous. So on the one hand, you have an unambiguous effect, take people from 0 to working, an ambiguous effect here. That could be why we don't see a difference, but here's why we don't see a difference really. People don't understand. It's super complicated. If I say to you, hey, guess what? You used to get X going to work. Now you get X plus a big check. I'll go to work. If you say, well, on the margin, if you work 1 more hour, your income goes down by 21 cents. I mean, you're MIT students and you didn't quite understand it. Okay? So the answer is, I think, my theory, it's not good evidence, is that basically this effect is so subtle and complicated that people don't pay attention. Whereas the you get a big new check if you go to work effect, people pay attention to. I'm not saying that's been proven, that's my theory. The bottom line is it doesn't matter what the theory is. This is a win-win. This is a program which is redistributing money to the neediest people in society. It's about something like, oh God, I forget, something like an $80 billion a year program. It's $80 billion going to the poorest members of society. And it's increasing work. It's increasing work. It's increasing efficiency. So that's a win-win program. Okay? This is not just in America. Mexico, a great example, a wonderful example. The president of Mexico had a good buddy who was a sociologist who knew a lot of economics, who convinced him to set up a program where they give money to mothers only if their kids got their immunizations, sorry RFK, got their immunizations and were enrolled in school. And guess what? It had a huge effect on improving kids' outcomes, even their incomes later in life. Sadly, the current president of Mexico got rid of it. But this was an incredibly successful program. These conditional cash transfer programs have been successful all over the world. And that's a way we can solve the leaky bucket. It's a positive story for how government policy can do better. Anyway, I'll stop there. I'll see y'all on Wednesday.